Hello, welcome to the Officio Spotlight podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb and thank you very much for listening. And indeed, a very belated Happy New Year to all our listeners. We're going to have a slightly different format in terms of the podcast today. We thought it'd be really interesting, given the time of year, to pull together some thoughts and opinions about what the next 12 months hold for our industry in terms of procurement and supply chain. So really delighted today that you're going to hear a number of different voices from colleagues of mine within Officio, all of whom are experts in their own fields. And we're going to be looking at a number specifically. So my colleague Ed is going to be talking to us about what he thinks the future holds in the sustainability space. My colleague Isabel talking about the Middle East. Imad talking about his perspective on the US market, Dan talking about the public sector, Mark talking about the utility space, and then finally, my colleague Mert will be talking to us about private equity. So delighted and privileged to have so many experts on one particular podcast. I'm sure you'll find it really interesting. Have a listen. And then, of course, this time next year, we can get them all back and see who was right. Over to you, Ed.
My predictions for 2024 with regard to sustainability and sustainable procurement, which is an area I have particular focus on within Officio. One of the key things we're going to see develop in 24 is the amount of legislation that's coming through and how that starts to impact businesses. The scale of legislation, but also the severity of it is starting to increase, and it's starting to move and combine quite significantly. So, for example, we have things like CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And this is one of the several pieces of legislation that are really focusing on businesses having to be responsible for their supply chains. So as over the last few years, we've seen organizations think about the carbon impacts in terms of scopes 1 and 2. And now scope 3 is very, very important, which is typically the emissions that sit within the upstream and downstream supply chain. Similarly, organizations need to now take control of their first, second tier supply chains as well in terms of how well they're performing. I'm going to throw lots of acronyms here at you, but you have CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is going to start to bring transparency to the impact of moving products across borders. So it's going to become harder to produce goods and services in one country and then sell in another, and start to, to some extent, ignore the impact of that production when it's in a different country. And then more on the social aspects, we had a conversation actually with a founder of an organization called Unseen this week, who focus around modern slavery, forced labor, and they're starting to see legislation really pick up in their world as well, but really having the teeth that some quite significant fines are going to start to get imposed on businesses. As often happens, this will probably focus on those kind of big, larger businesses, consumer brands that we're aware of, to create some level of attention, but quite significant fines, possibly, not dissimilar to what we saw in terms of private information and disclosure of that. So I think that's going to be really, really important. So the whole momentum around sustainability and net zero, it requires government to step up and give a level playing field for businesses to work within. And from what we see, businesses do want to act on this. They see it as a differentiator. And there's a lot more facts and statistics now available around how high-performing businesses are the ones that have leading sustainability propositions. So that kind of business value, share value correlation is starting to be really, really proven. I think that's one of the key things. And I think for me, that's really exciting because it's going to get people focusing on these targets much more seriously.
Thanks, Ed. And now over to you, Isabel.
Okay, so forecast for the Middle East. I think the expansion in the region will continue. I mean, you can see more projects being announced every day, especially now with all the new in Saudi Arabia, with all the, the World Cup in 2034, with the Expo in 2030, with obviously the Asian Winter Games as well in 2029, is a capital project is just going to become increasing more and more. And this is really creating a challenge in the supply market. And obviously what it means for the supply chain is not only that you have to bring all the material to bring all those people, but also is the sheer scale of those projects. What we're talking about is how actually are you going to manage? And also, is there even enough capacity in the market to do that. And we have been seeing this already, that there are some materials that the market is not able to provide. And recently, the government announced that some of the projects that they were for the deadlines for 2030, they were going to be extended the timelines to ease the pressure in the market, because essentially they are competing against themselves in terms of availability, and obviously that the price inflation as well that is happening in there. What we see is that it's going to continue on that. So it's more about focused supply chain, how you're going to be managing that, but also as well with the sustainability as well. Obviously sustainability with the COP28 is a big push in the agenda of all the MENA region as well, particularly of course in Saudi Arabia, because you know that as part of the Vision 2030, the goal of the country is to become carbon zero at 2060. So that means the push in terms of defining what does it mean for your procurement activities, for your supply chain, is not only buy more sustainable product, but also is how do you reuse your logistics? How do you produce locally? How do you manufacture locally as well? And that is also combined with the ESG agenda, the social part of the ESG, that is a lot of obviously the push for localizing in the spend. That is also part of the Vision 2030, that not only puts the pressure in terms of how do we increase the manufacturing capability, or that how do we create an industrial ecosystem that is going to be able to provide that, but also you're looking at the manpower as well. So it's the big push to increase the capability, to increase the skills of the organizations, but also to push them along the maturity curve in terms of getting more closer and closer to best practices and to world class, and to embed this structured ways of working. And all those things obviously is making more and more visible procurement and supply chain and being a real added value partners to the organization, and be sitting at the C-suite level in terms of being adding that value, because it's going to be challenging, because just the numbers are massive when you start looking at those projects, but also the sheer ability of the workforce at what does the speed that you can be upskilling, training your local workforce, and you can start building that manufacturing capability as well. So it's going to be a fantastic year of growth and plenty of opportunities for everybody to contribute.
Thank you, Isabel. Really interesting. And now over to my colleague Imad to talk about the US.
So we're anticipating a few trends for 2024 in the US, and we feel that these are all areas procurement can bring a lot of value. Firstly, we anticipate a lot of ongoing CapEx builds. So this will be mainly driven by the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the legislation around infrastructure that was passed recently through Congress, and reshoring. So as more companies reshore their operations to be more domestic, we think that this will all lead to more plant expansions and new build infrastructure. So with that, there's going to come some risk, like aligning to schedules, materials availability. So this is an area where with good procurement practices, good supplier relationships, risk can be mitigated. Second, we feel the macro environment will drive the need for margin expansion for reinvestment. Top line growth will be harder to come by. Debt will be harder to service. Therefore, we think that companies will turn to improving the bottom line, essentially cutting costs out in a sustainable way for their operation. So in that sense, procurement will play a large role throughout to 2024. Thirdly, we feel due to the macro environment, suppliers will be driving inflation to business. This will be driven by shortages, fluctuations in the materials markets, geopolitical risks. So strong supplier relationship management, ensuring that you're working with the right partners will all be very, very important. And lastly, we think that 2024 will be when we start seeing AI as a change agent. We think it's going to happen, or it's going to affect folks both internally and externally within their businesses. So internally, it'll assist with being a bit more efficient around meeting preparation, reducing effort, being able to test out insights. But externally, it'll affect company spends. In some cases, it'll help bring spend down. It'll make suppliers more productive. But in other cases, it could cause spend to increase when we think about stuff like AI cloud services. We're excited about the upcoming year. We think a lot of opportunity ahead, and we look forward to working with our clients to help them achieve their goals.
Thanks, Imad. And now to Dan.
So I think going into 2024, there's going to be a couple of big themes for public sector procurement leaders to tackle. The first one is not going to be new to people, but is going to carry on, and that's going to be uncertainty, change in markets, in expectations, and generally in all parts of the role. Now, that's going to come in the shape of an election and whatever government is the result of that. It's going to come in the resettling of markets as inflation probably trends down, and it's going to come from ongoing international events which are coming thick and fast and only going to continue. That's going to be I still think procurement organizations are not always good at dealing with change. They're not always good at dealing with uncertainty, where we're incentivized on can we spend less than last year, even though in some ways last year feels like a different millennium at times. So I think that's the agility and the speed of reaction that public procurement leaders are going to need to show this year is going to continue. And we're going to have to, as a procurement community, we're going to have to get better at moving faster, reacting, doing different things, deploying different techniques, whether that be the basics of different contract lengths, different commercial terms, but it's probably going to mean there's just an awful lot of work to do. The days of do a long contract, lock in the prices and throw away the key are long, long gone. So I think that's going to be the first big challenge. And within that, expertise is going to be increasingly key. Credibility, flexibility in teams and resourcing models will be very, very important as people react to whatever the next year throws at them. That, though, comes alongside the opportunity that comes with the Procurement Act in the UK. And I think it's generally been very well received by the procurement community in terms of what that's trying to achieve. To us, it's exciting, but it's also pressure. If I was a finance director or I was a DG in one of the government department, I would be looking at procurement and saying, right, there are no excuses now, right? Yeah, again, the days of being the rules police and the compliance police need to be over, along with in the same way of doing a long contract and throwing away the key, right? That's gone. So expectations should go up, but also that means the opportunity for procurement to do lots of the things that it's been trying to do for a long time is greater. So there is a greater opportunity to be innovative in how you tackle markets and how you approach markets and how you run processes. And that's really exciting. It's also going to be uncomfortable for some people who have worked in the same way for a long time. But for the profession as a whole, I think it's very, very exciting. And it comes back to some of those same themes of, do you have the expertise? Do you have the flexibility? Do you have the business mindset to work with the rest of the organization to take the opportunities?
Thanks, Dan. Really interested to get perspectives on that sector. And now we'll hand over to Mark. Talk to us a little bit about utilities.
So I think the utility sector remains a really interesting place to be working at the moment. You can't get away from the headlines around environmental errors, investor dynamics, customer challenges. I'll choose my words carefully. There's so many moving parts in the sector that clients are having to navigate. I think diving into our world of procurement, it remains a key lever to drive stakeholder value. Money saved enables more activity to improve services for customers. We're still seeing examples of the struggle of legacy public procurement, often caught between wanting to have that commerciality and pace of the private sector, but compliance with the public sector and really excelling in neither. But we are seeing loads more examples of ambitious procurement function in the sector really adding value in recent years. Diving into water, it's a busy period at the moment in the water sector. We're coming to the end of AMP7. We're starting to prep for AMP8. AMP8 is set to be a big step up in terms of programme size for most of the organisations in the sector, with some of the biggest programmes we've seen. This brings the challenge of capacity in the marketplace to get all that work done, which I'll talk about again in a second. Again, in water, it's the busiest period for procurement functions, with lots of their contracts aligned to the AMP period. Most are out in the market or even selected their partners to deliver the programme for AMP8, and many are testing new contract and delivery models based on the lessons learned from previous AMPs. As well as planning for AMP8, there's still big challenges in finishing off AMP7 in terms of budget challenges, in terms of commitments to meet what they've said they will to the regulator. And as such, there, as well as this big strategic activity, there's still tactical activities, but taking place both internally and with a lot of the key suppliers. Across the whole sector, as I said, there's a big concern around capacity at the moment. There's big programs in electricity focused on kind of increasing capacity for the use of EV and meeting the country's net zero requirements. There's big big infrastructure projects happening outside of the utility sector, as we all know. And this just means that the biggest challenge, I think, is this scarcity of resource in the supply chain. And our clients are putting a big focus on making sure they're engaging with their suppliers around this. They're putting in place protection in their contracts to deal with this, and a lot of the time getting into the market early to kind of protect themselves against what some of this scarcity in the supply chain is going to be.
Thanks, Mark. Finally to Mert, talk to us a little bit about private equity.
So private equity 2024. As you know, there has been record levels of fundraising and a really high level of dry powder around. So the leading private equities are still looking into some potential investments. There has been some uptick in the activity, but a lot of dry powder waiting to be invested, which will mean that we will expect to see high levels of competition, and that often drives higher needs of margin improvement. And from the other side of the global economic perspective, there is increasing margin pressure on the existing portcos or the new portfolio companies joining in to these private equity firms. And that is across industry. So from technology businesses, healthcare businesses, manufacturing businesses, B2C businesses, we see an increasing pressure on margin on EBITDA, which again, as we've seen through multiple crises, we see again and again in many private equity portfolio companies, procurement and supply chain is an untapped lever, often is an unmature area or an area of opportunity where people are focusing. We are seeing an increased level of driving, more systematic, more intense value creation through procurement and supply chain, which are applicable for existing portfolio companies, for newly invested portfolio companies, or in critical events like M&A, mergers, carve-outs, so on and so forth. The other aspect of this game is maximizing impact in 2024, obviously. While we are focusing on maximizing the run rate benefits, trying to get things optimized, important part of that is increasing the 2024 in-year impact. And one of the lessons learned, and we see this again and again, if that's an objective for a portfolio company, we highly recommend to start early. We are now at the end of January. I hate to say this, but we are already late. Let me put it that way. At the same time, it's never too late. We just got to get going, especially for the firms with ambitious 2024 impact. Start attacking quick win opportunities and launching some of the strategic initiatives across all category groups: direct spending, indirect spending, technology spending, and so on and so forth. The second important point, an important trend we are seeing is, traditionally, we've seen a lot of portfolio companies, unmature procurement teams, supply chain teams, they get some turbo boost, additional effort, support from Efisio or some other type of support, and make an incredible impact, 6 months worth of projects, and this team leaves. And what we are seeing now differently, increasingly, the impact on the sustainability of these benefits, on EBITDA and cash benefits. So what happens is we deliver, or a portfolio company delivers, high impact through an initial 4, 5, 6 months of effort. Then they launch the second wave of value creation, and then leaving behind a sort of a platform, sort of capacity and capability to keep delivering year-on-year value, to sustaining some of those benefits and attacking new opportunities. So the portfolio company can see, the incremental benefits. And this has become even more important in the times of inflation, in the times of, certain prices are increasing, because it doesn't matter if you've done some one-off event 3 years ago, your cost base would still increase, and you need to keep managing that, keep optimizing that, which is a fundamental success factor for, private equity and portfolio companies to tackle and to find their own solutions.
Thanks, Mert, and indeed thanks to all of my colleagues from Efisio for joining us for this conversation. Been fascinating to hear everyone's perspective on what the next 12 months hold. And here's hoping 2024 is a happy and successful year for all of our listeners. Thanks a lot.